So if you look at the cover of London Calling, which is the third Clash album, it was the first Clash album, which was only released in England initially. First album was released in the United States, was called Give 'Em Enough Rope. Then the third proper album was London Calling, which was the one that blew them up. The cover of London Calling, famous blurry photograph taken by Penny Smith of the New Musical Express of Paul Simon smashing his bass in disgust on the stage of the Palladium after the Clash gave one of the best shows they ever gave in their life. I was there.
So today is Monday, March 22nd. Who are we speaking with?
Oh, David Leifer, live and direct from Brooklyn, NYC.
Talk to us about where you were born and where you live now.
Okay, they're actually not so far away from each other as the crow flies. I was physically delivered as a baby in Bronx Lebanon Hospital in the Bronx the day after Christmas, December 26, 1963. So a day after John Kennedy took a bullet in the head in Dallas, you know, here I pop up. And 2 days after me, or three days after me, that very same week, Joe Claussell was born. Joe and I got onto the planet 72 hours apart.
That's pretty fucking awesome.
Okay, so I was born in the Bronx, but that was just because my mother became pregnant with me when my parents still lived in the Bronx. My older sister, Elise, was already a baby, and they were about to move to Queens, but my mother's doctor was in the Bronx. I was born in the Bronx, but I never lived in the Bronx. I lived in Queens, in Fresh Meadows, until I was 5, you know, but I have good memories of, you know, early childhood. And then I grew up, went to school, high school in Westchester County, in Hartsdale, but the school district was called Greenburgh, and the town was called Greenburgh. Town that I resided in, where we got our mail, was called Hartsdale, which is also the stop on the train. It's a zip code, but the school district was Greenburgh Central 7, which was a merged district that was created to combine like a sort of existing mostly white area and existing mostly black area. And it was something of an experiment in the late 60s when they launched this, because we were close to White Plains. There was, in any case, there was a need for a secondary school. They built one, and it was a racially mixed community, as many were. I mean, White Plains was as well, Mount Vernon was as well, Yonkers was as well, but it was unique in certain respects, from the fact that, as opposed to Yonkers, where there would be a high school, let's say, or Mount Vernon or wherever, White Plains, there's a high school. So there's like a part of town where the Italians live. We're bringing them over here. You know, here was like two distinct communities that had distinct history. They said, we're going to create one school district and we're going to combine these communities. And that was something novel. And so I got bused to some schools. In other instances, the kids from a certain community got bused to my school, and that's how it went. But I was in that school system for almost a complete run, from the very end of kindergarten all the way through high school.
Wow.
And now I live in Brooklyn. Since I've been an adult, since I've been out of college in the mid 80s, most of my adult life has been spent in Brooklyn, in different neighborhoods in Brooklyn. Now I live in Park Slope, and have for the last few years. Before that, I lived in Windsor Terrace. I lived in Carroll Gardens back when I was in my 20s. And other than that, I lived in Manhattan for a couple of years, and I lived in California, in San Francisco, for 3.5 years in the mid 90s. I worked for a law firm out there. So I've been around, but for most of my life as an adult, I've been in Brooklyn. I love Brooklyn.
Talk to me about your household. What did you hear music around the house, or where did you get your love of music from?
Well, my father loved music, and my father had tried his hand at clarinet when he was younger, and he loved jazz. So when I was, old enough to be in the band, in grade school, so I took his clarinet and I learned how to play clarinet. He got me lessons and whatever. So my dad listened to jazz when he was in college, I think mostly. And he went to NYU when it had a campus in the Bronx. And then I think after he graduated, he was in the Army. So he had a couple of years, between that and starting his career. He eventually became a lawyer. Then later on, he was much more interested in classical music, and he listened to mostly classical around the house. But he still was interested in jazz, and also when my sister and I were little, so he knew that the Beatles were happening, and he liked them. So he, turned us on to them.
Nice. And then talk to us about, do you remember the first record that you bought?
Yeah, Let It Be by the Beatles. 1970.
Wow.
Yep. On Central Avenue in Hartsdale. And I was into the Partridge Family too, but that was a couple years later.
And then tell us about the transition to starting to go clubbing.
Oh, well, it wasn't, for me, I was always interested in live music. I always went to see bands. I mean, I was going to see bands with my friends or on my own in arenas from the time I was 13. When I was 13, that first year that I started going to shows, I saw Led Zeppelin, I saw Yes, I saw Bad Company, I saw Emerson, Lake and Palmer, I saw Fleetwood Mac, Crosby, Stills and Nash. That was all in 1 year at Madison Square Garden. 13. So I started hanging out, going to see live music when I was a real kid, because my parents had split up. My father soon got involved with another woman, then remarried, and he lived nearby, but he was out of the house. My mother had a full-time job, or no, actually part-time, I think. She worked at Bloomingdale's and she had some other job. She was out of the house. I was of age. I was into music. And my parents were pissing me off. I went off and got involved in music. So I started going to shows and seeing legendary bands, when I was a kid, before I really could appreciate it. I saw the Grateful Dead when I was 14. Then from that, New York was nice at that time. Things have changed a bit, but it was when you were old enough to get into a club, whatever club was, you could go to a club. But they didn't make that differentiation, which was the nice thing about New York. They didn't give a shit. When I was coming of age in New York, all through my high school years, and then it changed right after that. But up until 1981, 82, the drinking age in New York State had always been 18. So as a teenager, even though I looked young, I was on the small side and I didn't look like, that I was grown up. They just didn't give a shit. You could go at the age of 14, 15, 16 as a male from the suburbs, you come from Long Island Railroad or Metro North, coming from the boroughs. You could go to a bar around Madison Square Garden, go a night that they had the Ranger game on or the Knicks game on or whatever, or boxing. You could go in there as a 16-year-old and get served, and the bartenders did not give a fuck. Anyway, so it was that environment in New York, because the drinking age was lower. They weren't unused to seeing kids around in bars. I mean, please. New York was an open town. It was crazy. When we would walk down the corridor on 8th Avenue, say, if we were coming from that side to go to the Garden, go down 8th Avenue and get some pizza or something, like on the way to see a band. After coming from Grand Central, where our train would let us off, Hartsdale. Come down 8th Avenue or 7th, just go through like the seediest part of New York City, where all the porn theaters were, hookers, and some of that stuff, I'm sure we didn't even know what was really going on, but we knew something. People trying to sell you drugs. Like I'm saying, we were like 13-year-old kids. Hey, kid, you want to buy some Tournols? Like, seriously, it was that crazy. Hookers everywhere. But we didn't care. We thought it was fun. They weren't bothering us. We thought it was cute, So like I said, so as an adolescent in New York City, in the 5 boroughs, in the suburbs where I grew up, you could easily come in if you were adventurous, which not everyone was, or if you had friends, or you wanted to explore something. For me, it was music. Come in, for other people, sports, sex, whatever, drugs. come into the city and you could find your thing, and age was not really an issue. So when I got to be a little bit older, towards the latter part of high school, so 16, 17, there was Irving Plaza, which still exists as a room. It had been a Polish dance hall, like for the Polish community in the East Village, or well, it's an Irving Place, but north of 14th Street. They opened it up for Polish weddings, and wouldn't be bar mitzvahs probably, but community events. And then excuse me, when I was in high school, they started doing live shows there. So I went to see Reckless Eric, who's an artist that was on Stiff Records. I think it's on in 1980. The show started so late that I missed the train back to Westchester because the train stopped running at like, whatever, 1:30 or something. So we missed the train totally. We had to spend a few hours hanging out in Grand Central until the train started running. And at 6 a.m., we were able to get back to Westchester. So we had to kind of hang out in Manhattan for a few hours because we missed the train. But it was cool. But New York was crazy like that. I remember going to see Madness that year, a year later, at the original Peppermint Lounge. Not the one with Joey D and the Starliners, but the first one that Rudolph and Jim Farrat were involved with, that first dance area, which was in the Times Square area. I saw Madness there. I was working at Stiff Records. I had an internship there, and we heard about this show. Madness was going to do a surprise show at the Peppermint Lounge, to show up and play unannounced. These guys got on at 3 in the fucking morning. 3 in the morning they got on stage. Yeah, so New York was what? Also people from California, even that is something unfamiliar to them, that you'd be in like a legal venue, a bar, and they're open that late, but they were. New York served until 4 a.m. So I started going, so Reckless Eric was the first show I saw at Irving Plaza, but then there were good theaters, mid-sized theaters to see shows in. I saw a lot of tremendous shows at the old Palladium on 14th Street, years before it was ever turned into a disco, and obviously now it's just a dormitory, but in its original incarnation, it was the New York Academy of Music, then the Palladium, then they turned it into a disco, then it became an NYU dorm. NYU owns like half of New York City now, basically. Anyway, the Palladium was 3,500 seats, which is a good sized theater. It's larger than most Broadway houses, but it's smaller than Radio City, so it's right in the middle there. But there was a big balcony, a big high balcony. So there was a lot of, they packed in a lot of seats. So I saw the Ramones there. I saw Bruce Springsteen there, Elvis Costello. I saw the Clash there twice. So legendary Rockpile, the Buzzcocks, the Fall, the Stranglers. No, so the Stranglers at Irving Plaza. But there were some great places to see shows. And once I got to the point of finding out about bands that weren't like on the arena circuit. In other words, when I was 13, yeah, like I knew about Led Zeppelin, I knew about Yes, I knew about the big popular. Boston was one of the first shows I went to. Chicago, I went to see, actually my dad and my stepmom took all the kids. We went out to Long Island to see Chicago. They were actually quite good. Geraldo Rivera was the MC because it was like a charity event. Anyway, so those are the first few shows I saw, like spring of '77, in quick succession. Boston, who only had one album out at that point. Why the fuck they were playing Madison Square Garden? But they were massively popular. They had a huge album on the charts. So Boston, Chicago, Led Zeppelin. Then that summer, Yes, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Fleetwood Mac. It was a good summer for music. And then '78, so I was into the big popular bands. Maybe my cousins turned me on to something. Someone I heard on the radio, someone my friends liked, someone I read about in a magazine. Mass media, AM radio. Then I started listening to FM radio. Back then, there were two primary FM stations that you could get in New York that were the most influential for people that, of my age, which was WNEW-FM and WLIR, which is a Long Island station. So I learned about tons of music. I also read the press. I subscribed to Rolling Stone. When I was in my senior year in high school, I subscribed to the New Musical Express, which was the leading weekly in London. Occasionally read Billboard just to see what was happening, but it was a very expensive magazine, so you didn't get it that frequently. But And I read Trouser Press, which was a new wave magazine, which was fantastic. So I heard about lots of music, turned other people onto music, and I would go see these bands. Because if you were on the circuit then, every band had to come and play in New York, just like they had to play in San Francisco, they have to play in Chicago, probably have to play in Austin, a few other spots, Miami. You got to hit the spots if you're going to do a proper tour. But New York, you want to get written about in the press, you want to get noticed. Back in the 70s, if you wanted anybody to give a fuck, you had to come to New York, no question. And LA and San Francisco, it was a circuit. So New York was the first spot because that's where the airports are. So we got everybody. So I think I told you the story, but maybe not. So if you look at the cover of London Calling, which is the third Clash album, it was the first Clash album, which was only released in England initially. First album was released in the United States was called Give 'Em Enough Rope. Then the third proper album was London Calling, which was the one that blew them up. The cover of London Calling, famous blurry photograph taken by Penny Smith of the New Musical Express of Paul Simon smashing his bass in disgust on the stage of the Palladium after the Clash gave one of the best shows they ever gave in their life. I was there.
Wow. So let's transition to.
So those were the clubs. In other words, Irving Plaza was kind of a club, but then an actual club. What happened was I was working at Stiff Records. I had an internship. The first club, like the big club experience I had at that point, and then I think I got to Xenon once, but it was discos weren't my thing. I like to see live music. Hurrah was a combination rock club that Jim Farrat booked, where that was a club. They had a DJ, but they also had rock bands from England and New York, like local punk bands, new wave. So in terms of clubbing, in terms of like what we think of like a disco, a DJ, disco ball was Bonds. First place I went to was Bonds because when I was working at Stiff, we had a band that was, Stiff was a British label, but they opened up a New York office on 57th Street in a building that doesn't exist anymore. It was torn down. They put up a condo or hotel in its place, 157 West. The address is still there, but the building is gone. Anyway, right near Central Park. Beautiful location. So they opened up a New York office. They signed some bands. The Plasmatics were one of the bands that they had on the label. So the Plasmatics, when Bonds first opened in spring of 1981, and it was a huge place. It was a converted department store that they turned into a discotheque and concert hall. So Plasmatics gave a press conference there about I guess an album release that they were doing, or there were some, a tour or something. So we went, because we were working at the label, we went to, and then later the Plasmatics were booked on the Tom Snyder show. I don't know if you remember Tom Snyder. He had a late night talk show, came on after Saturday night. It was a cult thing, but he was a well-known broadcaster before that. But in that time, I'm talking about 1981, he was on at like 1 a.m. or something. Anyway, he was cool. He had the Plasmatics on to perform, and we got to go because we worked at the label. It was crazy fun. I think they brought a television onto the stage, and Wendy O. Williams sawed it in half. And I used to have to go run errands when I was at the label too. So I had to go down to Rod Swenson's loft one time, down on like Franklin Street or something, down in Tribeca. He had a loft space. He and Wendy lived there because she was his girlfriend, and she was also in the band, and she had been a stripper and a sex worker. I mean, it was crazy. And I remember I had to go get something from Rod Swenson, who was the Plasmatics manager, Wendy's boyfriend. As I was like waiting for this like industrial elevator to come get me, like here's like Wendy O. Williams like coming down into the lobby. Oh, hey Wendy, how you doing? So I was like, I'm like hanging out with like these crazy like punk rock legends. Then later on she killed herself, unfortunately. But so I ran with we had Stranglers up in the office one day. Lee Perry came up to the office one day. So I got to meet the Upsetter in person, hang out with him. He was delightful. Yeah, so I was rolling with we got to see Burning Spear at the original Ritz on 11th Street. Got on the list, didn't even pay. Just, they called over. Oh, we knew this girl. We were, or someone, this woman who worked at Stiff, secretary or whatever, she was there for what? She knew people who book shows at the Ritz, or knew the promoters. They call over, anybody from Stiff want to come to a show? Oh, we want to go see Burning Spear, boom. And we got on the list. I went to see Burning Spear in 1981. And I'm telling you, this was a time, you would see people smoking or whatever. It was like you go to Madison Square Garden, people lit up. But then you're talking about in the Ritz, like this was like, it was like you could not see the stage. I could not see Burning Spear. There was so much smoke. And it wasn't like all little white hippie Rasta, reggae fans. It was hardcore, real Rastas, straight. It was 80% Rastafarians in there. It was fucking great. Years later, I saw Burning Spear at the Roxy, and it was a much more mixed audience, but back then it was like hardcore. Burning Spear, fabulous. Yeah, and I remember the DJ was playing just crazy like dance hall reggae, between sets, and it was a good time. So that was the Ritz in '80. So I got to go to the Ritz a couple times, in the spring of '81 when I was still in high school. Got to go to Bonds for this press, and then that spring of '81 when I was graduating was when the Clash did like a 1 month run at Bonds, which was only supposed to be like originally 7 or 8 shows, but they overbooked them. Someone called the fire department, shows got raided, the Clash felt bad that they'd sold tickets and people couldn't go. So they basically scheduled like a month of shows spread out so that everybody that had bought a ticket at Ticketron, this is when we had Ticketron, everybody that had bought a ticket could be accommodated. So the Clash played for like a month in New York between May and June, and I got to see 2 of those shows. Lee Perry opened one, and check this out. The other show, and like I said, this was at Bonds, which was a great place to see a show. Huge place. It was a little too big, but it was a very cool place to see a show. And a good disco. I mean, Kenny Carpenter used to rain down there a little bit later on when Mike Stone did parties there. That was a legendary spot. Anyway, for the Clash, it was so one night Lee Perry came out. I remember he had the Mets batting helmet, which he's often photographed in. He must love that batting helmet. He was wearing his Mets batting helmet. He did one song, it was one song that lasted easily 35 minutes. There were no breaks, there were no transition. Whatever he was doing, toasting the band, vamping, it lasted half an hour, then he split. That was cool. People were like, what the fuck was that? Then, the other night, the opening band was ESG. People didn't know what to make of them either. They're doing like this kind of like minimalist, crazy funk. So ESG were playing. And the interesting thing is I had a similar experience with ESG opening up for a famous English rock band prior to that also did not go well for them, where I saw them probably maybe the prior summer at Woolman Rink, which was later Donald Trump renovated, but they used to have concerts there in the summer, Dr. Pepper Music Festival. ESG opening up for Joe Jackson, and they got booed off the stage like during the first song. And Joe Jackson came out and he read the audience, like he totally read them. He felt really bad. Joe Jackson got turned on to ESG. This must have been 1980. He invited them to open for him at a big show in Central Park in front of a big crowd. Joe Jackson was very popular. They came out, they got booed off the stage. They didn't even let these girls finish one fucking song, and they had to go. And so then I saw them, so it's a year later, 1981, I guess, at Bonds, opening for the Clash. They didn't get booed off the stage. The place was still filling up. I think there weren't enough people in the room to boo them off the stage because it was like sparse, So they didn't get booed off the stage, but people had no idea. People came to see the Clash, in 1981 when they were already getting popular and whatever. They weren't all about ESG, but they didn't boo them. They were just kind of bemused. Then who gets on stage? Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five, and they did get booed off the stage in a hail of cups. They were selling beer at the bar, and like I said, back then, New York did not give a fuck. I was 17, I'd easily get a drink. They were selling cups of beer at the bar, no bottles, thank God. Grandmaster Flash got to do 1 or 2 songs. I think they were doing Birthday Party or something. They were doing. I liked them. I wanted to hear them play. The Clash fans booed them off the stage. And I spoke to Tito of ESG, who was a conga player. I spoke to him at the Loft once about those experiences of seeing them both times. And I spoke to Grandmaster Flash about his experience opening for the Clash when he was DJing at the World in 1989. And he chuckled, He's a bit of a prick too, but whatever. Everybody got screwed. Anybody in the music business that has an attitude, and I'm sure you've met a few, I can guess, probably met a few. In some ways, you can always understand it because everybody got screwed over by anybody. Have you ever had anything to do with the creative side of anything? Photography, fine arts, architecture, dance, music, DJing, film, whatever. If you ever had to do that and you wanted to try to make a buck at it, you're gonna have to deal with some assholes, and that's always been, and the club business and the record business and the hip hop dance music business, forget it.
Forget it.
So anyway, it's goes without saying.
What is the Loft?
Oh, that's a. I mean, you know, we would have to devote many hours to, you know, to properly cover that. But in an executive summary fashion, the Loft in its initial stage wasn't even known as the Loft. It was known as David Mancuso's apartment, or which was a loft, but it was his house. It was David's home. The Loft was a name that came to be associated with the party sometime after that, but initially it was David Mancuso taking a template from Harlem rent party society, hanging out uptown and seeing that occasionally a social event would be thrown to raise some rent money, and people would be invited over, liquor would be served, etc. So he experienced that background, brought it downtown, and then he had all his hippie acid friends that he knew, and he brought them into the mix, and that was the genesis of David's first venture into hosting parties in his home in 1970. You know, with just the idea of having some fun, tripping, and coming up with some money for the rent. And it wasn't an idea that he ever claimed to originate, but he brought an interesting mix of people into it. He also brought his own philosophy and personality into it, and his own crowd and his own touch. And he also understood the importance for him and his party goers of providing a proper environment, including a proper audio environment. So it was both the selection of the music, the sequencing, the groove, the way it modulated, and that it be produced in a way that was respectful to the people who made the records. So the music was produced in a sonic way through his hi-fi, in a way where if you were listening to a jazz record or symphony or string quartet or disco record or whatever, it was going to be true to the way that the musicians intended it to sound when they recorded it. That was David's concept in its pure state. And then from there, you know, things change and the world changes and music changes and technology changes. And David adapted with those changes to a certain extent. He tested out certain things. He rolled with certain punches. He innovated his own things. Certain things he took a long view, and then he came back and said, I think this was good or bad. He was definitely someone who had strong feelings about digital sound and how digital sound might compromise true reproduction of sound. But of course, at a certain point, David, by necessity, was playing a lot of records at the Loft that were produced in some form with digital equipment, recorded digitally, mixed digitally, etc. Wasn't anything he could do about it. But in terms of his presentation of the music and the playback system, it was all analog.
What made the Loft so special?
So once again, you could be launching into hours of conversation here, but in a sound bite, what makes it special to me, first of all, the duration, okay? This is like a snap of your fingers kind of culture that we're in now, that people are not encouraged to be interested in things longer than 30 seconds, because that would hold up the flow of commerce. Novelty sells. Nobody's building careers, you know. So the fact that David Mancuso created something without any like real, you know, forethought, was literally just a rent party with nice people taking nice drugs, listening to nice music on a nice sound system in a what ultimately became a very nice part of New York City, but at that time was sketchy and was more industrial, which is why he was able to get a loft, and why other contemporary people of that time, including people like Ornette Coleman, James Blood Ulmer, etc., jazz artists, were able to obtain loft spaces in and around New York City because it was cheap. David paid, as much as he was throwing a rent party, he wasn't paying much rent, but he was doing it to like get something going. He was David was inspired by the hippies. He was inspired by music. He was inspired by Timothy Leary. He was inspired by gay liberation. He was inspired by the peace movement. There was a lot of interesting stuff going on in New York in 1970. Oh my God. Right around the corner, literally the same weekend that David threw the first, what was called Love Saves the Day party, first what became the Loft party, February 14th, 1970, literally just a few blocks away at the Fillmore East, the Grateful Dead were engaged in a run of shows that are among their most legendary.
And how did you? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Two seminal psychedelic music moments in the same neighborhood, essentially, the East Village and environs, all in the same weekend. It boggles the fucking mind. It's like if Beethoven wrote the Ninth on Tuesday, and then Mozart came along, you know what I'm saying? Shit that shouldn't happen, happened. David Mancuso decided just randomly, I'm throwing my party, and right down the block of Grateful Dead, we're not just doing a set of shows, but a set of shows that are considered amongst the best of their career of 30 years. So this is significant. David was in the mix with those acid heads too, so that makes it more significant. Anyway, what was your question? I'm sorry.
How did you discover the Loft? Who brought you there, or how did you hear about it?
Okay, well, first, in terms of the chronology, my chronology is the opposite of the way the parties developed in real time. The Loft began in 1970, as I said. It sort of came into its full flowering when they moved to Prince Street, which was around 75, something like that. 74, 75, David had to move out of the original location on Broadway, moved to Prince Street. That location they had for about 10 years, and that's considered the golden age of the Loft. And I was never at Prince Street, but I'm familiar with the era, but I was not there. And I wasn't at the garage in that era either when the Loft was open. I didn't get to the garage till later. But first I went to the garage right before it closed, got a card, then it closed.
What is the Paradise Garage?
Yeah. Okay, so that's a better way to start the saga. Paradise Garage was a club that I first went to in 1987, just 6 months before it closed for good. But it had been around for 10 years before that. I just didn't go there. I just didn't really look. I'm like a straight white guy from the suburbs, basically, and I wasn't really hanging out in gay black clubs. But somehow I found my way over there, and I was like, this is cool. Plus, the garage had developed by 87, where they split it into two distinct nights. So there was a Friday night, which was open to anyone. There was Saturday, which was still core night, reserved for gay members, okay? That's how they tried to break it down, because the club got so popular that they had to kind of break it off sexuality-wise. You would get a Friday membership, which was a little cheaper. That would allow you to go Fridays, which was straighter, although not straight. Saturday was much more core, much gayer. And that was, for a lot of people, that was like more like, oh, you got to go on a Saturday. It's more fabulous, because that was like, but people had differing opinions. I don't know at what point they differentiated that and started offering the separate Friday, Saturday membership. But when I went to the garage, I had a Friday membership. So anyway, I found myself there. And when I found myself there, they even had discovered that Paradise Garage was such a powerful thing that they needed to basically create a whole straight night to accommodate all the straight people that heard about it on Frankie Crocker's radio show, or that knew the records, or saw Larry's name on records, or just heard about this fabulous club that you could not fucking go to because it was private. So they weren't trying to publicize this place because it was gay and there were things going on. It was all about not publicizing. It was like anti-marketing. They didn't have to market themselves because they were a private club that sold memberships, and that's who went to this club, and their friends and industry people, and so did others, but not just any schmuck off the street. It wasn't like that. It was after hours. Place was open until sometimes 2, 3 in the afternoon on a Sunday once things got going, you know. A lot of drugs in the air, you might have heard. It was a drug place, and they were protected. It was a place that grew out of a space that had been controlled by the mafia, and for as far as I know, it continued to be. Then later on, it passed into the hands, or it became a leased space of Verizon. But it was straight gangster before Michael Brody got there, all right? And they had tried putting a club there. It, for whatever reason, didn't work in that space. Supposedly, DePino found out about this. Like, I heard Reed Street had closed, which was the prior club Michael Brody and Larry did in like 76. DePino heard they were looking for a space. He heard about this spot and they brought them up there. And then that was 10 years of the garage. But when they first opened it, Michael Brody and Mel, that had the idea that, it would be more like for fabulous white queens, and they tried that concept a few times. And so that was the idea, that it would be a white gay club. And they opened up in the middle of a snowstorm. As a result of that, it was a big disaster. There was a delay in the sound system arriving and being installed. And from that point on, the white queens weren't really feeling them. And they went back to like, okay, we'll be a black gay club. So it was kind of like that. But there were a lot of different stories. Other people will tell you other things. And if someone was actually there, then I would go with what they say. But this is what I've heard from people that were there, that it wasn't like, let's make what we think of as the Paradise Garage now is like the quintessential gay black club on a big scale, New York City, in an era, the post-disco era, when things blew up in underground dance music. A lot of this music did cross over to the pop charts. We know people like Grace Jones and Chaka Khan and LaBelle. These were not like cult figures. These were people that sold records in massive amounts. Part of that was the garage, and all those people performed there. It was an important audience for them to have. Plus, it was just the spot. It was the spot. It was nothing else like it. The Loft continued and existed contemporaneously, but the Loft was always its own thing. Even when the Loft was in a big space at Prince Street and there'd get a lot of people in there, it still was very much the idea, this is David's home, this is what we're about. The Loft had its own vibe, but the groups of people went from one to the other. Some people will tell you, like, some people lean more towards, I'm a Loft head. It's nice to have even been able to have the choice, but I wasn't at the Loft during that time. I was at the garage, then they closed. The Choice opened up, which was David's Loft, but had been leased to Richard Vasquez. David was not running the Loft at this point. We're talking about 88, 89, 90. David was in upstate, living upstate, cleaning up. Richard Vasquez leased the space, made some enhancements to the sound system, brought in his own team of DJs over time. So we went to the World, where Frankie Knuckles was playing from 88 to 89. Right around the corner was Robots. Right around the corner from that was The Choice, AKA The Loft. It was a good time to be in New York. So that's how I came to be introduced to, like, oh, this is where The Loft was. And I started hearing the name David Mancuso and meeting people that were associated with The Loft, like Doug Sherman and other people that came to The Choice, but they had also gone to The Loft and blah, 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 blah. Then Richard Vasquez lost the space. There was a horrible social club fire in the Bronx in early 1990. All the after-hour spots and social clubs and under-the-radar spots, of which there were many in Alphabet City, got raided and closed down, including The Choice. And boom, that was it. I was there when the cops took over. Frankie Knuckles was DJing. I was there. Police came in. David Dinkins came in. Well, not him personally. His task force came in, the social club task force. They were wearing, I think, like these yellow slickers or something. About 3 a.m, bust in, big flashlights. Frankie's playing. All of a sudden, close the party, turn off the music. And they told Frankie if he didn't take his records out of there, that they were going to take him to jail. So luckily, Frankie lived just down the street. So he had a cart. We wheeled his records down to his house, and he was fine. But they knew that until this guy leaves, everybody's going to think that the party might get going. And that was it. That was the last party of The Choice, May 1990. The end of the following year, so the end of 91, Mancuso came back and restarted the Loft at 3rd Street. So that was the first time I went to a proper Loft party with David Mancuso. Although even at that point, Douglas was still playing a lot. David would show up sometimes who knows. But I got to meet David and I got to experience the Loft. And then I moved to California, and then David lost the spot. And I came back. They had Jelly Bean's place for a little while. That didn't work out. Then they found the Ukrainian home. They've been on 2nd Avenue for 15 years, I think now. So that's been the longest running location of an otherwise rather itinerant party. In terms of just the genesis of it, there never would have been Larry Levan doing what he was doing. There never would have been Nicky Siano doing what he was doing. There never would have been Bacho Mangual doing what he was doing. Morales, Knuckles, all these people never would have developed their career in the way that they did had they not gone to the Loft. And I'm talking about people that go back to Broadway, which is several years prior to Prince Street. That was the first generation of real New York City underground DJs learned their craft from Francis Grasso and David Mancuso and D'Acquisto, period. That's it. That's the first generation. From there, a lot of other shit happened. But that was the initial fade. So all that came from David and Francis. But Francis disappeared rather quickly. And the Mafia dispatched him, and that was it for him. And David continued, and we're still going 50 years, including years after David himself has left the planet. So that's how strong the Loft is. In terms of contrasting with the garage, so as an initial matter, the very concept of what Larry was trying to do with sound, the way he programmed music, the eclectic nature of the crowd, the eclectic nature of the playlist, the idea that we did not give a fuck about which hole you put your private parts into and whether you wanted to wear women's clothes or not, or what drugs you took or whatever the fuck you did in the privacy of your own home. We didn't care. It wasn't about that. It was about you come, be accepted, enjoy yourself, have some fun, dance, enjoy the music, be part of our family. That was it. So David had a smaller idea of that, which is a very noble tradition of the house party, than the rent party. So the house party as a way to get by in New York City where things are tough, and as a way to build a community, which he certainly did. From that, Larry expanded that into a physical space with a defined address and sonic approach, but thousands of people. David was generally not thinking on that scale. This garage was a bit too much for him, and in terms of volume, definitely too much. Also, equalization and mixing became a critical part of dance music in that era, in the 80s particularly. David shied away from that mostly, and also he tried to keep the sound pure. So he wasn't mixing, he wasn't cutting records, he wasn't interrupting a record. The record played from beginning to end. There was not much equalization. The volume was kept at a fairly modest. If you ever heard any complaint during the heyday of the Loft, well, the Ukrainian home anyway, before Douglas started playing regularly, when David still would play the parties, if you ever brought someone there that wasn't a Loft head or whatever, the big complaint you would hear is that David doesn't play loud enough. So he was very specific about checking decibel levels, about not overloading the system. Some of that had to do with not wanting to abuse the eardrums. Some of it had to do with wanting to be having a truer sonic presentation, etc. That was David. In the Doug, Etowah, Colleen era, they've gotten louder. But like I said, things change. David's not here. David's not here to call the shots anymore. And for a long time, Douglas was basically left to his own devices with the music or whatever. So it was dealt with after he died, or not dealt with. So that was so Larry got the idea of a lot of concepts about sound, about music, about community, family, parties from David, as did Nicky and other people, Frankie. Other people were influenced by him and what he did. And Larry turned it into something that was a club with a massively powerful sound system, clean. Like the bass wasn't just loud. We've all heard loud bass. This was clean, loud bass. There's a difference. Everybody had that experience, and I've not described it uniquely. I described it once this way and then heard 5 other people basically give the same impression, which is that when you entered the garage, you would hear that bass just like in you. It was just like beneath you, around you. And it was similar to like George Clinton with the ramp to the mothership. It's like you had to walk up a ramp because it was a fucking garage. You walked up the ramp and then you went into the garage. This was a garage. They turned it into a club, then they turned it back into a fucking garage. It had a cyclical history. Now it's nothing. Now they've eviscerated the very building. It's gone. 84 King Street does not even exist on Google Earth. It has been destroyed. There is no 84 King Street. It's gone. 77 Charlton now. Anyway, this was something unique to itself. What Richard Long and Larry worked on, all the money they had, the industry connections they had, the crowd they had, the parties they did, the legendary people they had, that was the garage. It was like fabulous. The Loft was always the Loft. You know, it's just us. You know, like it was nobody needed to. No flash. David was, if he was anything, he was anti-flash. David resented any sort of, at least in theory, whiff of commerciality. You know, trying to merchandise yourself, trying to, you know, ring the register. So he would say. But that was David's vibe anyway. Like, don't commercialize the Loft, don't advertise, blah, blah. So he held true to those ideals somewhat. But that was his idea. The Garage, even though they didn't need to advertise because it was so incredibly successful after a certain point, not from the jump, but after a certain point, they were making money. There was no need for them to spread the vibe because they had their crowd, they sold memberships, they had it covered. If they sold 2,000 memberships, and I know they sold a lot more than that, they could have sold 4,000. Memberships, even then, in 1987, just for a Friday membership, I think was $75. So if they sold 2,000 Friday memberships, they had 150 grand in the bank. Just boom. They were fine. They were fine. And then they sold Saturday too, which those were more expensive. My membership card, hold on, I have some. My membership card is like 2008, and I got one of the last ones. So they sold well over 2,500 memberships that last year at $75 a pop for just for Friday membership. Then they probably sold another 2,500 or more for the Saturday membership, was probably $85. So these guys were making their money. And that was money that they had in the bank or whatever they could use to, you know, improve the sound system. But and when the place first opened, I think Larry was living there for a while. He actually lived in the garage. Like he did like the Junior Vasquez thing of like, yeah, I'll just have my apartment at the club. He would go roller skating over there. He would invite his friends over to get high. I mean, it was like a whole thing. Larry was a nut. Larry was a total, like I knew Frankie and Larry and I knew David. They each had their own personality. David, like very quiet, very shy, very lucky. Larry was crazy as fuck. Frankie was like, you know, very like, he was like sensible, like he was like the sensible one, you know, Frank. So those were the things that you would, you know, take away if you met these guys. Like you meet Larry, you'd be like, oh my God, that guy's crazy. David, was like super elusive, you know. It took time to even have a word with David at some point. It wasn't because he was rude. He was just doing whatever he was doing. He had a certain vibe about him that you even felt like, can I even go talk to this guy? You know what I'm saying? Frankie was very nice and very friendly, but he was also very serious minded. He wasn't like a clown. He was like Frankie was like, all right, let's talk business. Or, you know, he was to the point, very polite. Like, you know, you knew that he was okay. Like if you needed like a sober driver or something, like Frankie Knuckles, yeah, call him. You know, he's the sensible one. So and then so when Frankie and Larry were kids and they were, you know, hanging out together, that was the dynamic, like the yin and the yang. Like Frankie, like the more sensible one, Larry, like the complete lunatic, and that's an interesting dichotomy to their friendship.
Now, was Larry the original intended DJ for the Garage?
Yes, absolutely, because they had a spot on Reed Street that got a little bit of a vibe in Soho. Reed Street was the first place that Larry and Michael Brody did together. That was the template for the Garage. So yeah, they always wanted Larry. They just weren't sure exactly what crowd they were going to snatch. There weren't a lot of black DJs in the big DJ booths at that time. They were mostly Italian. So even to have a black DJ was kind of, I mean, there was Tony Smith. There was a couple others. Tony's one of the few. You see that picture of those guys? It's almost like all Italian guys, and then Tony Smith. You know, there's not a lot of black guys there. So Larry was but even that, it's even deeper than that because shit, 1975, Larry and Frankie were the DJ team, and obviously we're both black then as well. We're the DJ team at the Continental Baths, which was a totally white gay scene prior to it becoming Plato's Retreat in the Ansonia Hotel. So you had these two black guys, one from the South Bronx, one from Bed-Stuy or thereby, you know, guys from the hood who were in the gay life as teenagers. In the very early 20s found themselves DJing at the most notorious gay bathhouse in New York City. There's an interesting tale in and of itself. And out of that comes the later legacy of the garage and the warehouse and that whole scene, because that was the first time those two men worked together, was DJing at the Continental Baths. I wasn't there, of course, but I don't think there were a lot of black guys running in and out of there. As far as I know, the bathhouse scene in New York City, pretty white. I've seen some ads of the Continental Baths. I've seen some pictures. It was people that was into opera. It was white queens from the Upper West Side. It wasn't no black people. So the idea that Frankie and Larry were the DJs there is too fucking hilarious. Plus the idea that they had a bathhouse that had its own, they had food there. They had a disgusting swimming pool. They had lockers where you could go have sex. It was crazy. And then you look, if you look through the other end of the looking glass, you have 20/20 hindsight, and then you're like, oh, no wonder all those people started, dropping dead because they were doing crazy shit like that. But meanwhile, from Larry and Frankie's perspective in the mid 70s, before there was any AIDS issue, they probably were just cracking the fuck up saying like, can you believe these people? Like, they would bring opera singers into this fucking place. It was so hilarious. People would be there all hours of the night doing drugs, fucking in the booths. Jesus Christ. Can't even imagine. And here they were. Larry was 20, Frankie was 19. There were two black kids and they were DJing at the fucking Continental Baths. So no wonder they went on to greatness after that. They had quite an interesting apprenticeship, one would say, as like teenage DJs. Continental Baths is notorious for so many reasons that have nothing to do with Frankie and Larry. Bette Midler got her start there. Barry Manilow got his start there. There were albums recorded there. There were movies made about this place. And I'm saying this is the history before Larry did Reed Street or the Garage. This is the history before Frankie went to Chicago. They were already involved in some crazy shit in New York. They were barely out of their teens. Come on. Never have something like that now. Because New York was just crazy.
Talk to us about the world. There were a number of different DJs that played there. Tell us about what is the world and who are the DJs that played there over time?
Oh, the only time we would go to the world was when Frankie was playing. I wasn't really too fussing about anything else going on there. But there were other DJs there. Morales played there. Fuck him. Dave Piccioni played there on Saturdays. I went a couple times. Like I said, I spent enough time going there like basically every week, tripping on mushrooms or MDA, listening to Frankie like every Friday. I didn't really need to be at that club any other night than that because we'd go to other clubs. There was a choice right around the corner, remember. The world was not the only thing going on. Anyway, Frankie was the primary reason I went, but they did have Grandmaster Flash down in the basement at one point. That's when I had an occasion to speak to him about the incident opening for the Clash, and we had a bit of a chuckle about that. But I think I ran into some of the guys from Depeche Mode in there one day. They had interesting people up there, so saw some good performances. So Daryl Pandy performed there. I think Liz Torres performed there once. They used to have some good live music downstairs sometime. Anyway, we run into very interesting people there. It was a very cool club. It was a very happening club. It was big. It was exciting. It was dangerous. A lot of drugs around. And then, because there was an after-hour scene around that, so the world was done at 4:30. We would roll out. We'd be out for another 7-8 hours. I'm saying we were high. Like we didn't give a fuck. And I was young. It was energy to burn. We would go around the corner. John Hall was playing at Robots. It was right around the corner. That place was open till all hours. You could get a drink in there at 5 a.m. Go back down the block, closer to Avenue C, and that's where the Choice was, and then later the Loft. We were out till all hours, so we had fun. But the world was originally a catering hall that was on its last legs. It was a multi-story building with a balcony. That's where the DJ booth was. A main floor where the dance floor was, and this place would rock. It was like, woo, they had no air conditioning. Downstairs, there was another space that had a bar, another DJ set up down there. I remember, I think Dimitri from D-Light, I remember seeing playing down there. I saw some other people, they had like the club kids would hang out down there. That was the world. 89, we stopped hanging out there because Frankie had started doing the Paradise Ballroom, but that only lasted like, the batting of an eyelash, and then that was gone too.
Explain to people what the Paradise Ballroom is and the whole sound system situation.
Oh yeah, the sound system. The saga is interesting and sad, but interesting. The story is based on, I think, what Mel put in his autobiography, other things that I've heard, but in Paradise Garage, Loft, Clubland, there's 1,000 stories, so you're never really sure exactly if I tell you, David Leifer was in the room when something happens, like you can rely on that. If I tell you I heard something, then it's only as good as who told me or whatever. But you hear things. Story was, and I think it was put into print. When Michael Brody knew that he was dying very shortly, he had a will in which he was going to leave the garage sound system to Larry. It would have been a very, very valuable sound system. Larry and Richard Long had essentially created it. Richard Long died too. I'm not sure exactly in what time frame, but probably not too long. So a couple geniuses worked on this thing. Michael Brody essentially funded it, but it was also the proceeds of the garage were largely a result of Larry's effort. So at some point before things changed, it was in Michael's intention, I believe, to leave the sound system to Larry because the garage was going to close. They were going to give up the lease. He figured, all right, Larry's out of a job. Let me give him the sound system. He built it. Fine. Then whatever happened, could have been Larry's self-destructiveness, could have been other things intervened. Larry wound up not getting the sound system in the will. It went to this guy, Jaime de la Cruz, who was Michael's lover. He inherited it. He had this partner, Sammy. So in 1989, they came sniffing around the world and hired Frankie Knuckles to be the new DJ at what was going to be the reopening of the garage. But it was they weren't involving Larry. Larry didn't get along with them. They weren't involving Mel. There was obviously a lot of bad blood in that whole situation. Larry was still very much, in his self-destructive mode that led to his death a couple of years afterwards. So that was not news to anyone. They weren't about to hire Larry for this thing. And they were trying to go a different way. So they said, let's have Joey Llanos, that people know from the garage. Let's have him play on Fridays. Frankie will play on Saturdays for the Gay Boys. They found a theater on 43rd Street. I think it was called the Academy Theater, if I recall. They opened it in, I think, early spring of 1989. Frankie had been playing for a year at the World at this point, more than a year. So he was very well known in New York. He was starting to do some big remixes. He was getting a name. Jaime figured, okay, I'm getting a hot DJ. I'm going to bring, and as I said, he and Sammy or whatever had their hands on the garage sound system. They paid to renovate this theater. I think before the club even opened, they told Joey Llanos that his services were no longer required. This is the nature of Jaime de la Cruz. Like, this is the kind of person you're talking about. But Joey and Richard were already doing the choice at that point. So Joey had, he had parties. He wasn't that concerned. He knew Jaime was a scumbag. Everybody knew that it wasn't going to work out. So they hired Frankie. Immediately things went wrong. They were charging too much money. People weren't coming. People realized, oh, wait, it's not the Paradise Garage. Yeah, no shit. Larry wasn't there. Frankie wasn't playing garage classics. The whole thing was just wrong. Fell apart very quickly. The club got closed for fire violations. They stopped paying rent. Their lease went into foreclosure or whatever procedure. They seized the garage sound system in payment for rent in arrears, and it was auctioned off at public auction. Frankie Knuckles had to run in at the last minute because he saw the auction notice. I remember talking to Stan at Dance Tracks about it. He had a copy of it. People were going to go bid, like, oh yeah, let me go bid on Larry's turntables. It would have been so cool, but I forget how it worked. Anyway, Jaime fucked up. He skipped the country. I think he wound up dying eventually or killing himself. I don't know. Nobody liked him. Slimy. Garage system was sold at auction in whatever that was, 1989. And boom, off it went. So there you go. They lost the sound system. People told me that there were things that were still in boxes. Someone told me that there were like confetti machines that they had bought when the garage was still open that they'd never taken out of the boxes that were sold, at like things that were unpacked. Larry told me a cool story once. He said that they had a confetti machine. I'm not sure if I think they might have done this at Studio 54 because Richard Long put in the system at Studio 54 and Larry was like a VIP member there. And it was also when the garage started going. So, he was over at 54 sometimes and they hung out over there. Nikki was over there for a minute. Anyway, because of Richard put the system in, so Larry, I think, would go. So I think Larry told me once that I think it was that they filled up confetti machines that they had at Studio 54 that would launch confetti. But in the confetti machines, they put poppers, amyl nitrate, and they launched them onto the floor. So when people would come to dance, they were like stomping all over these poppers, releasing, the amyl into the air. So he said that was one of the things that they did at 54 one time when he went over there. Larry was too much.
What is Dance Tracks?
Oh, that was a store. Well, that's an interesting thing, is that was just everything going on at the same time in the same neighborhood. It was kind of remarkable. Like I said, East 3rd Street was the spine. The East 3rd Street, where the Hells Angels were, but next to the Hells Angels, or 2 doors down from the Hells Angels, I'm talking about right off of First Avenue, is where Frankie Knuckles lived, which was 67 East 3rd Street. Frankie lived there. He initially had a 1-story apartment. Then he got a duplex. For a time, Robert Owens shared the apartment with Frankie. He had one bedroom. Frankie had another bedroom. So Robert lived on that block and in that apartment. Like I said, 2 doors down was the Hells Angels headquarters, which they finally sold a couple years ago, but they had for years, since the 60s, with the building there. And then 2 doors down from that was Dance Tracks, which was a underground dance music store. But then you continue a little further east on the block. So Avenue B and 3rd Street was where Save the Robots was, which was after our spot. You go right around the corner from there to East 2nd Street. That's where the World was. And if you go back on the block to go a little further down East 3rd Street, almost to the corner of Avenue C, that was the Choice / the Loft. So this was all in the same several blocks of New York City. And also, Sun Ra lived on that block at one point in the 1960s. Sun Ra had an apartment on East 3rd Street. This is a fucking magical place. So Dance Tracks was like our hangout, but we also were hanging out in all the clubs around there. And I didn't mention a few of the places that we went to, but there was also a place called Cave Canem, which I think had also been a gay bathhouse on Avenue A. That was a hot club for a while. There was the Pyramid, which was on Avenue A. That was happening. There were other, East Village was alive. Pyramid had, DJs. I mean, it was like a legitimate, dance, little dance place. The East Village was crazy. And you also still had, anarchists and, punks and shit in Tompkins Square Park. There's a lot of shit going on. Skaters. East Village is crazy. A lot of the New York City hardcore scene is from that area. The Bad Brains used to have a rehearsal space over in that part. The Cro-Mags. There was like a whole punk scene right in that little part of town. And Mancuso was on the block for many years. He lived on Avenue B. He was sort of like the mayor of the neighborhood. Anybody had a problem, they would go to see David. He was like a community leader. Seriously. He was cool with everybody. That's how he got in with the Ukrainians. Everybody liked David. He was a good cat, and he was someone that he cared about people, and he was a decent person. Some people were impressed with that, but he was part of the East Village community for decades.
Let's talk about area. What is area?
Oh, area was an interesting spot. It was interesting in my personal history because it was what led me to the garage. It was right down the block from the garage. And it's also, people don't know it as area necessarily, but they know it in many of its other incarnations. At the point when area was happening in the early to mid 80s primarily, and then it closed. But in the early, throughout its run as area, the address was 157 Hudson Street, and that was the entrance. And you see crazy pictures of the early days of area where it looks like thousands of people trying to get into this place. It was insane. I didn't go there quite that early, but I went there probably as of 84, 85. I was hanging out. Anyway, but I went there. It was a great. But later on, we know it. And people that are involved with your website and listen to your broadcasts and see your photographs and stuff know it as 6 Hubert Street more likely, when it was Body and Soul and Shelter primarily, and Danny Teneglia's Be Yourself Party all were based at 6 Hubert Street. And that was the address that we used. That was the entrance that we used. It was the same building, just 2 different entrances. Anyway, as area, it was a very artsy club because it was designed to accommodate the arts community, because they had display windows. People would actually put their art up. Sometimes they had live installation. Like sometimes you'd actually see people sitting in there. They had all kinds of crazy stuff. But it was like the real art scene. It was like the legit downtown art scene that had a lot of exciting people in it then, like Basquiat and Warhol, et cetera, et cetera. So it was attracted the art crowd. And the art crowd had a lot of money then. It was a lot of white money, a lot of Soho real estate gallery money coming into New York at that time, kind of money that drove David into the East Village, was building up, the scene. And so just like in Williamsburg and just like in Tribeca, there's an art scene, there's a club scene that gets to be hot, little cute restaurants, little cute galleries, loft spaces. They get rid of all those people, and then they bring in the rich white people like John F. Kennedy Jr., who lived in Tribeca. Anyway, so that's what killed off vinyl. It was known as vinyl, but it was 6 Hubert Street. That's what killed off Body and Soul, as a real estate wetlands, of course, which was right up the block, But as area, it was an artsy club, and arts crowd, had a lot of fabulous, wealthy people hanging out there. Basquiat used to DJ in the back there. I got to meet the Beastie Boys in there before they were even known. They were known to me, like they'd been on the New York scene for a while, and they'd been part of the hardcore scene, but they were known to me through the media, but their first album had not been released yet. They had a couple 12 inches out on Def Jam. They weren't really big or anything. They weren't known to the masses. So I hung out with them one night. Yauk and Ad Rock hung out with them at Airy one time. I remember running into William Hurt there once. I was there for like a promotional party for some. I remember seeing Penn and Teller there. It was a happening. And Timmy Regisford played there, and Johnny Dynell played there. He was playing there, I think, the first time I kind of noticed who the DJ was. 80s. Anyway, it was a cool spot. And like I said, then it turned into 8 zillion other clubs, but mainly known to our community, because of Shelter, because of Body and Soul, because of Danny Tenaglia, because of vinyl. Kenny Carpenter did some parties. Oh, Louis Vega did parties there. There were some very nice Louis Vega parties that were done at that space. A lot of people use that space. But Body and Soul and Shelter were really, the main parties in the late 90s, whatever, early and then Tribeca, just like Williamsburg later on, just like the Meatpacking District, et cetera, East Village. It was an artsy neighborhood that got hot. Then the real estate values drove all the clubs out because millionaire condo owners don't want a lot of brown people hanging out on the street doing drugs and listening to crazy music. They want to be able to walk their dogs in peace. And can we blame them? They want to go to the organic butcher or coffee shop and not have to trip over a bunch of, drunk house heads,
What is Body and Soul?
Body and Soul was a party that began, I think, around 1997, which was around the time that I came back to New York City from California, having lived out there for a few years. That was Francois, basically, Kevorkian basically created the party, brought in Danny Krivit as co-DJ and Joe Clauzel, and they sort of established a residency initially at 6 Hubert Street. That lasted about 4 years. And turned into a brand, turned into a legendary thing. But the initial stages of the party, and the sort of the classic, or to me the best periods of the party, probably for the first few years, 97 through 2000 or whatever, it was very cute. Then it got a little Euro, it got a little white, it got a little crowded, it got a little annoying. Joe Clauzel turned into a bit of a diva, stopped showing up whenever he felt like not showing up, blah, blah, blah. It became less interesting than what it had been. And also Joe started to assert his musical personality more forcefully on the nights that he did bother to show up. And that was kind of annoying. I just kind of got over it after a while. Joe's residency at Love, I enjoyed quite a bit, except once again, he played too loud. Because the man's probably mostly deaf, so that would explain that. But yeah, it was a great spot on McDougal Street. Had good times there, a really cute spot, great sound system. But Joe it just was too much. It was just like, there's too much sound in here. The speakers were like 8 fucking feet high. It was too much bass, too much, just leave it out. Anyway, that's Joe. Great DJ, great history in music, very talented, good mixer, good selection. just plays too fucking loud, and he EQs the records too much. Just Joe, let it play, please. I know you're a genius, blah blah blah, but just let the record play. Just saying. So Bonnie Soul was that. So it was a good run of 3-4 years at Hubert Street. Then after 9/11, John Davis decided, enough of this. Got to get out of downtown. And then since then it's become a floating party. They travel around the world, cashing checks.
What is Be Yourself Party?
That one I actually never went to, despite all the good feeling that I have about Danny Tenegli or whatever. It was Danny Tenegli's party. I think it was Fridays. He had a residency at Hubert Street. It was more like a more techno-ish vibe, I think, than maybe what I was, or more progressive vibe than what I was into listening to at the time. But they had a very cute crowd, and Danny got his thing going there in terms of what the kind of music and programming and everything that he was identified with kind of came out of that party, and he built a real global following. It just was not really my thing so much. Like, to me, Danny Tenegli, when I first started hearing him play, it was a much blacker thing, but that's just personal taste. But he's a great DJ. He's a very nice guy, contributed a lot to music, had some great success, really playing by his own rules. Danny Tenegli's not one who compromised. He's like, this is what I want to do. And, he found people that were interested,
What is Shelter?
Oh, don't get me started. No, I'm just kidding. Shelter was a party that Timmy Regisford started in the early 90s, once again at 6 Hubert Street. Then later on, it was more like he was, one of the parties that was taking place in this space, but initially it was kind of like his space. Timmy had a whole background on radio, with Boy Jarvis, on BLS, with Frankie Crocker, playing at Better Days, playing at Area, playing at a lot of clubs, involved in Motown, done a lot of great production, involved in promoting Jersey house music. Very important name in house music history. He always wanted to be a DJ. He always kind of wanted to follow in the garage kind of mold, be like a Larry, kind of, have that kind of vibe. So he started Shelter in the early 90s, I guess. And then once again, so it had a run at Vinyl. That ended. They had a spot on 39th Street. They had a spot on Varick. Then they were over here in Public Records. Timmy's an important figure in music. But as a DJ, he was never really my cup of tea. Not to say that he hasn't given me some really nice nights, because he has. Just, it was never, I always felt that people were like a little too devotional to Timmy without there necessarily being all that much to back it up as a DJ. As a producer, remixer, industry person, radio person, blah, blah, blah. He made his name, no bones, But as a club DJ, on certain nights, he was fine. Other nights, I would go to Shelter, and I'm not talking about I just passed through the club once. I'm talking about I used to go there regularly. It wasn't that interesting to me. Sorry, Timmy lovers. I know it's sometimes sacrilegious to say that. Lil Ray, whatever, I have to bitch slap him.
What is 718 Sessions?
Okay, that's one that always puts a smile on my face that I can talk about with True Love, which is the party that Danny and Benny have been doing for years and years now. Which also, like the Loft, like Shelter, like some of these other parties we've discussed, had to move around from place to place to place. It was 718, because all you little kids out there, here's a news flash. 718 was once the area code for Brooklyn. It isn't any longer, because Brooklyn has 89 area codes now, because everybody has a cell phone. But back then, 718 represented Brooklyn. Ergo the name. And I think actually it had some roots, I think, at the Halcyon Records, in South Brooklyn. Then it kind of took off in Dumbo, and then it moved across the river, and it was on 22nd Street for a while. Then Santos Party House. So it's been, and then they've done events here, events there, Output. Nowadays, what's that? Anyway, it moves around. We've done out, 718 moves around, but it's always Danny Craven is basically the musical engine. Benny is the promoter, and they got the great classic remnants of the Loft Garage family. Those of us that before coronavirus, still would go hang out and support. Danny's party is nice. Typically, it was just once a month, so it wasn't like you'd get tired of it. It was always like a nice vibe. You'd always see friendly faces there. Once again, it was like back to the concept of what we were talking about before about clubs and David and Larry and the idea of family and how you throw a party. And everybody's accepted. Nobody's judging anybody. There's no children there. Like, let me emphasize this because I think this needs to be emphasized. I love kids, like as kids. I love little kids. I love my sister's kids. I love talking to younger people. I met some great people at the Joy Party and Loft that really seem, interested in this whole culture. So that's fine. I'm just talking about people. It doesn't even matter your age. Just behave like an adult. That's what we've always asked for in the scene. That's what David always asked for. People talk about trouble this, trouble that. Talk about the garage. There was never any trouble because they had a crack security staff. Nobody was getting out of line at the garage. At the Loft, it was never even an issue that had to be broached too much. People just knew better. But nobody's tolerating any disrespect in that family because we're a family. You go to a restaurant or a movie theater, some commercial establishment, Walmart, can't expect it to be treated like family because it's not on that basis. When you come into the Loft, that's how we act. So anybody that can act like an adult and be open-minded and be friendly and be receptive and be courteous and be polite and all these things that we expect, then they're always welcome to join us. But occasionally we do have to put somebody in the corner and let them know, like, hey, motherfucker, you're out of line. I don't do that because I'm not assigned that job. I'm just there at all these parties just to have fun. But there are people that will have to, here, come over here, let me talk to you. Like, we don't do that. And it has to be said quietly, gently. You never see any fisticuffs. Sometimes people overdo it, take the wrong cocktail of things. It's happened to me. But so someone might pass out. It's not to be encouraged, but violence is not accepted in any manifestation, and nobody puts their hand on a woman.
Talk to us about what is the Mount Rushmore of house music?
Oh, right. So that was just something that we talked about because there was this, they started coming out with all these shirts with ampersands, names with ampersands. I guess it had been around for a while. But the one that caught my eye was the one that 101 Apparel did for the house DJs, which was David and Nikki and Larry and Frankie in the block letters with the ampersands. We made actually a run of those a couple of times. Basically, that one was saying these are whoever created the concept of that particular shirt. These are what we would consider the founders of New York house music, although for much of that time, the word house music wasn't really part of it. But looking back now from the future into the past, now that we do have a house community, now that there is house music and people understand what it's all about and the ethos of it and the history of it, so these people were the foundations of what we now refer to as house culture, but you could say post-disco culture, underground New York club community, whatever word, the Loft community, the garage community, the shelter community, whatever name, 718, all different people and parties and eras and clubs and DJs that contributed to this. What we think of as like, when you say, I'm going to go see house music, that doesn't mean that you're just going to go hear Marshall Jefferson. We understand that includes a whole broad spectrum of music that people in the house community listen to, from the 50s to whatever. It could be jazz, it could be funk, it could be Afro house, it could be disco, it could be techno, it could be a wide variety of things. But we say the house community because it's just an easy shorthand for who we are, who we become. So David being Mancuso, Nicky Siano being the person who then took the initial concept of what David did at, at the Loft, got kicked out of the Loft for dealing drugs and started the gallery. Then at the gallery, he brought in Frankie and Larry, who were interested in becoming DJs and throwing parties and this whole scene. They learned from Nicky, as opposed to David Mancuso, in terms of the history of DJing. Nicky Siano occupies a very prominent position as someone who really did start mastering the art of mixing and taking advantage of mixing technology at the gallery. And he also had a fabulous crowd. He had very good industry connections. He ultimately got connected to the point where he was invited to DJ at Studio 54. Nicky Siano was a guy who was good at promoting himself, and he was a very important part of the gallery. He worked on with some nice records with Arthur Russell. Nicky Siano is a name, an important name in our community. But his genesis in it was that David 86'd him from the Loft for selling drugs. Nicky managed to come into some money with his brother. They started this club, and that was the gallery. And David was away one summer traveling. They took over that summer, and that became the gallery, and that lasted for a while. But then within a couple of years, Nicky fucked that up. But anyway, he had a good run of a few years. He was good for he was behind some important records, and the gallery, for the people that went to the gallery, definitely before my time, people that went to the gallery that were like the early gallery people like you talk to, like Kenny Carpenter, the people that will swear by that place. They'll just say Nicky was the best. That was the best club. It was fantastic. Drugs, the music, the mixing, the vibe, everything. And Frankie and Larry were like first generation gallery kids. They had come from the Loft as well. And then, like I said, they went off to do the bad. And then they went off to do other things. So that's the first two, David, Nicky. Then, as I said, then Larry and Frankie learned from them. The interesting thing about my connection to those four people, and I'm definitely less connected to Nicky than I am to the other three, certainly. And I've never been a close friend of Nicky Siano's. I went to his party when he used to do the 12 West parties. I thought he was a halfway decent DJ. Otherwise, not too much to say. But David Mancuso, Larry Levan, and Frankie Knuckles were close friends of mine, all three of them. And I had the opportunity to speak at each of their memorial services in an unofficial, uninvited capacity, of course, which is my style. Just pop up in the audience and just don't shut your mouth for half an hour. That's usually how I like to go at it. So that's what I did at each of those events. And I think the words were appreciated. But the point is that, somehow I came into the orbit of these people that were not people that one would have thought, looking at David Leifer's earlier history, necessarily would have come into their orbit. But actually, yes, because the overall plan was I was always interested in music and all kinds of music, and always went to clubs and always liked dancing, always liked black music, always liked hip hop, always liked house music from its very early days. Got to know Frankie right when he hit town. Got to know Larry when he was on the Skids. Got to know David when he got back into the game, and then was good for another 25 years with David. So I got to run with some real important people without planning it. But like I said, I met Lee Perry, in 1981. I got to see Burning Spear in 1981. I got to meet in 1981 alone. Also that summer in London, met Joe Strummer in the street on Oxford Street and talked to him. Met Mick Jones around the corner, a record store. I mean, I've hung out with some heavy people back in the Beastie Boys. Like I said, these guys were. I was not just friendly with them, an admirer of them. To me, these guys are in the fucking pantheon. Beastie Boys, please, that. They're as important to me as the Grateful Dead, and that's saying something. The Beastie Boys spoke to me.
So it sounded like, either directly or indirectly, Nicky was a mentor to Frankie and Larry.
Yes. Oh no, absolutely directly, to the point where they blew up balloons for Nicky at the gallery. They helped set up the party. Larry particularly was interested in Nicky's DJing technique, wanted to know more about the art of DJing. But yes, there are pictures that exist, well-known pictures. You've seen them, I'm sure. Frankie sitting in overalls as a young man. So if this was 74, let's say, so Frankie was barely 20, sitting blowing up balloons at the gallery. So that was Frankie was helping out with the parties. Larry had brought him in to help. Also, Nicky would say to Larry and Frankie, here's some acid. Go give this out to people at the party or whatever. Like sometimes they would put it in the fruit or the punch. Sometimes they would just hand out tabs to people. So at the beginning of the party, that was one of the things that Larry and Frankie were occasionally asked to do by Nikki. Here's some drugs. Go give them out to the guests. But Larry was a bit of an operator. He generally would sell his. Frankie would probably more likely to give them away, but Larry was about selling his assets to people. So that's just some insight about Larry. But yeah, so they learned the game from Nikki. Nikki learned it from David, and he added his own flavor. But once again, like I said, there was a divergence there. There was Nikki that was very interested in the art of mixing as a DJ art. David, that for the most part didn't want to have any part of that.
So how important is mentoring in the development of a DJ's career? Because I'm not seeing the same type of mentoring happening with this generation.
Well, we don't have any clubs right this minute, so that makes it hard. Everything's virtual now, so yeah, you're not going to have that same kind of personal relationship. Like I said, when I mentioned Bacho as one of the first generation DJs, to the extent that they would go and hear Francis play and David and really study what they were doing. Later on, they would go to the gallery, do the same thing with Nikki. People that were like listening to the music that was selected, listening to the DJ technique, listening to the programming, the ambience, the way the lights were used. These were, Larry used to do lights. Kenny Carver used to do lights. All these people have multiple talents and interests and backgrounds that get them. Larry was originally the light man at the Continental Baz. The DJ had a hissy fit, left, and Larry became the DJ. So there's a whole crazy story. And then later on he brought Frankie in. But they learned their craft from Nikki and from David because the Loft was still going. Mentoring is very important. I think someone who would be important in mentioning in this regard, particularly, is Louis Vega, because he always had an organization that fostered young talent, brought people in. Louis would have people come and play, open for him at a party, remix a record for him, whatever. So there is a mentoring aspect in what some people in house music have done, trying to bring people in under their wing. Tony Humphries did the same thing in Jersey. It takes place, but it's dependent on personal connections. It was also a time when, you would learn the music by dancing to the record. I mean, Larry had to teach people. There's something that he particularly was known for doing. There would be a record that people were resistant to. They didn't like the style. It was too slow. Tanya Gardner Heartbeat is the classic example. It's a very slow record. It's not an up-tempo, make people go crazy kind of record. It's a grower. When Larry first played that at the garage, people did not like that record. They thought it was too slow. They didn't dance to it. Larry didn't give a fuck. He's like, I believe in this record. I'm going to play it again. And he did it, So people have to get educated sometimes from a DJ. So beyond mentoring of a career or whatever, dancers need to get educated. We learn about music from dancing to it if it's dance music, So we lost that when clubs were no longer the focus of learning about new music. There was a time back in the late 90s, because Body and Soul was a weekly party. So there was like a weekly event at which people could, hear things. Francois, Danny, and Joe, independently of each other and the party, were all involved with labels and productions and remixes and other things. They had a lot of their own music that they were creating that they wanted to promote, which is exciting. It was something that made the garage exciting when Larry would bring out a track, that he was just still working on and it hadn't been released yet, and he was still playing around with it. He was eating up someone's check on studio time, remixing something to death. That was Larry, to do. Mancuso less so, but with David, it was more about people would bring him something, and also he had the pool. David had access to a lot of things, and just to hear it on that system was also something, But Larry particularly, like the garage was a sonic laboratory. Play with sound reproduction in terms of speaker placement. Play with the lights, with the fog, with the movies, with the videos, with every aspect of the club experience was something that Larry could put his hands on if he wanted to, or bring someone in to manipulate. You know, it was that whole, they say at Reed Street, since it had been a converted meat freezer, there was a switch that Larry could flip to like make it like turn the freezer on and then turn it off. It was like working the EQ, but just with the temperature, you know, like make it really cold, make, you know, just crazy shit like that, just because it was all about atmosphere. And that was something that David was very involved with as well, you know. So the physical aspect of the club, you know, like I said, the body, in this case, body and soul. So you're at a place where industry people go. You're at a place where people drop off new records. You're at a place where Francois just remixed something for Wave Records, or Joe just remixed something for Spiritual Life, or Danny just remixed something for Giant Step or whatever. They had that record in their hand, and they wanted to share it with the crowd and see what kind of reaction you get. Because the only way to find out if dance music works is to see if fucking people dance to it. So we've lost that because at that point, like I said, now I'm talking about 20 odd years ago in New York City history, not yesterday. And then since then, we've lost a ton of other clubs, not pre-COVID. So we've lost the place, whether it was the Loft, the Garage, 718, Shelter, wherever Louis Vega, Underground Network, wherever we used to go to hear a hot new record or see an artist maybe perform, you know, at CLO. There were lots of places we would go. They're all gone. You can't have dance music without a physical connection to the dancers. And you can't have mentoring without people having access to the DJs in some way where you could actually walk up and say, hey, like I'm so-and-so, you know, I'm trying to DJ, and where you can get the DJ's time and vibe with them. And they'll be like, yeah, you know, come do this or check me out, or develop a professional relationship with someone. Clubs are nice for that. And we've lost that, and we're not sure if we're going to get it back. I don't know what the situation is with leases with these clubs. These landlords, it's not like they have a lot of other people that they can bring in. Like I can look at nowadays, like, okay, I'm your landlord, get the fuck out. Like, who are they going to bring in to pay rent? They might as well just go for a ride and see if these guys can generate some cash, you know? But it's going to take some time to see whether bodies are going to come back into these places and see who's still standing after a year on the sidelines, making $0.
What is Soulful House?
I think what people think of it is probably something that has a vocal in it. There was a time when tracks, like instrumental music tracks, became very dominant. And think of like Junior Vasquez kind of tracky kind of house, the ballroom, like the voguing scene, you know, kind of bitch tracks, something hard, snappy, not a lot of like soulfulness, not a lot of warmth. I'm not blaming Junior. There's a lot of tracky music, a lot of techno music that has that kind of vibe. It's like it's a tough track, but it's not a lot of emotion there. So to me, Soulful House traditionally, it's like you think of something like Blaze, Alternate, you know, Lisa Stansfield, you know, someone that sings soulfully and well, that uses lyrics, expresses emotions with some form of lyrical content, but it doesn't have to be lyrical. But yeah, something that would relate to something where if we say soul music, we think of soul music like Tyrone Davis, Curtis Mayfield, Aretha Franklin, Al Green, Teddy Pendergrass, you know, that's soul music. Like, if we find some common ground between that music that we all love and a house track, then I would say that's soul.
The future of New York City nightlife.
Oh, assuming facts not in evidence that there is such a future, we're gonna have to wait and see. New York City nightlife was facing some very, very serious challenges long before this stupid virus showed up, much in the same way that Black people were getting killed by the cops before the coronavirus. Amazing. So the real estate issues, which have softened somewhat, the real estate market is not quite so merciless now in the midst of an economic meltdown, so you can get a space. Meanwhile, you still need to bring bodies in. You got to have people that are willing to go mingle that way. Dancing is a very specific type of activity. You can't run a club at 50% capacity, it won't work. You can't make the money work, and people don't want to dance 10 feet away from each other. It requires physical contact, it requires sweatiness. Bodily fluids may be exchanged accidentally or otherwise. It requires people getting loose, getting a little high, and we're not there yet. But if I judge by the young people, I think they're down, because I think young people just don't give a fuck. So I was in Washington Square Park, and there was some kind of flash mob that developed, and there were thousands of kids boogieing down to like hip hop tracks and whatever. And it was like, okay, young people are down, so maybe it will happen. But yeah, the New York City has some like infrastructure macro problems. Like in some ways, some of those do get dealt with. Things do occasionally get fixed and get better. It's not an impossible situation, but it's a city that's running on low fumes money wise. Every neighborhood has their little hot spots. There's life in certain neighborhoods where there's not enough. I don't get to see the landlord's books to know what they're bringing in from their tenants, but I know that a lot of people are having a very rough time. And so that would include anybody in the entertainment industry. And for someone like Danny, let's say, who's our friend, where a large part of their career is not just dependent on 718, let's say, but also being able to get on a plane and travel. So there's a lot of different factors that have to come in before all our friends that used to make a nice living DJing can do so comfortably. Clubs have to reopen, airports have to reopen. I mean, Europe is now having a third wave. So in some ways, the United States is better off in terms of the vaccination process than a lot of countries. So to the extent that this industry, and we say the house community, which is a nice word for it, a global house community, and one that was thriving at some point, a lot of it happens from people traveling, from DJs being able to get on a plane, from a band being able to get on a plane, whatever, you go promote your record, you go promote your DJ career, whatever. You got to be able to go to Dubai, you got to be able to go to San Francisco, you got to be able to go to Europe, etc. And if they can't, and if people aren't coming, and it's not safe and it's not economically viable, then all those people are going to continue to struggle. It's going to take a long time for this world to figure out exactly how things are going health-wise, economically, in terms of social interaction, in terms of real estate, in terms of the banking industry. Joe Biden is sending me a check for $1,400 and 100 million other Americans in the hope that we will then turn that money around and help stimulate the economy. I'm going to do my part, but it just shows how uncertain things are. Because as soon as you hear about that, then they're like, well, do we need a fourth stimulus? In other words, can we throw some more money at this problem? We don't know if money is really, it could work. You don't hear anybody saying like, no, please don't send me money. Like, you're not going to get that. I'm taking that $1,400 and I'm running, but it's just like, who the fuck knows? I was in Grand Central last week. In the entire gigantic train station, there were maybe 25 people. It was like frightening. This was on a weekday. I was like, what the fuck? Yeah, it was empty. Grand Central Station was empty. So I don't know. They say even after the virus, even if it's not an issue of the virus, if it's just time, everybody's vaccinated, things go back to quote unquote normal. I read something that said that, New York City office real estate, which is where the money is, paying the rent in Midtown, not everywhere, but in Midtown, 85% unoccupied during coronavirus, people working remotely. And then they say that even after vaccinations, still 85% of those people are not going to go back to work on that schedule that they were in. So those landlords are taking it in the ass.
Last question. What advice would you give to the next generation of DJs and clubbers?
Find God. No, I'm just kidding. Advice. Well, I'm not the, I don't like to give advice about something like that, because I think that if I were to answer honestly about where I see the continuum, I don't see that it could ever be as interesting a club scene for these kids as what I was able to experience. And a lot of that is just down to the novelty of what it was when I experienced it. That someone like a Tom Moulton, a Danny Krivit, Walter Gibbons, Francois, etc., Shep Pettibone, the people of the first generation in the studio creating electronic dance music that was sort of reconstructed from an earlier version. Something that King Tubby had done in Jamaica with dub, but with a different intent. And basically someone saying to Tom Moulton, like, we have a nice disco, funk, whatever record. We like it. It's a good record. The artist is good. We'd like you to extend it a little bit. We'd like you to add a piece here or there, tweak it, make it a little bit longer, because we understand that the people in the discotheques, they like these longer records and they like orchestrate, so they would put it in Larry's hand or Shep or Tom or whomever, Savare's, and either, and say, here, go to work, So those guys were creating something that was new and interesting. When David Mancuso started doing his party and experimenting with the crowd and the ambience and the lights and the sound, and Larry did the same, and Nicky did the same, and Frankie did the same in Chicago, and all the early Detroit tech, talking about being in a scene in San Francisco in the 60s with the psychedelic music, where something fresh is being created, a new experience is being created. Because with the Dead, it wasn't just about the music, it was the whole experience. With David Mancuso and Larry Levan, it wasn't just about the music, it was about the experience. How are we feeling? They knew that substances were involved. It was part of the experience, So having experienced New York City and the club scene and the music scene at a time when things were really fresh, I saw the Ramones, before they were big stars. I saw the Clash before they were big stars. I saw Bruce Springsteen in a 3,500 seat theater. I used to see, I see people in small places before anybody knew who the fuck they were. They weren't on the radio. They weren't getting known, So I got to see exciting things when the scene was exciting, the world was exciting, New York City was exciting. People don't understand about the garage, the loft. Some of these parties would go on late into the afternoon on Sunday. People were still high on drugs. They don't get that. The kids that we see today are the ones that go out that you would have me give this advice to. They know of a scene that's primarily public, primarily regulated, primarily alcohol-based, primarily based on an alcohol economy. We are making our money by selling alcohol, which is not something that David or Larry or Nicky or Frankie ever did. They had a different way to make money. So it's about, you come into a regulated legal club between 10 p.m. and 4 a.m. in New York City. We make our money selling you a drink. We're gonna have a DJ over here. At 4 o'clock, get the fuck out. That's New York City club life. So I'll tell you right there, my advice is get in a fucking time machine and take the time machine back to 1975 and try that. Because they ain't never gonna be as good as what I grew up with. I'm sorry, that's not the kind of advice that we want young people to hear, but I'm just giving you straight facts. What I lived through in my life in New York City, from seeing Led Zeppelin at 13 and knowing Larry Levan in my 20s and hanging out with Frankie Knuckles in my 20s and hanging out with David Mancuso until I was in my 50s, we will never have anything that good again. Sorry. So enjoy, act like an adult, tip your bartender. Don't put your hand on any woman that doesn't ask you to put your hand there, because we do not need that. Don't talk shit to Asian people or anybody else who doesn't need your disrespect. Go out, support your DJ, support the people who make the club happen, which are the bartenders, the bar backs, the bus boys, the club owners, the people that are hustling to give you a good fucking time. Don't be on the promoter's ass about comping you every time. Go buy a righteous drink. Don't ask for a ticket. Don't just wait for the drink special. If you're a house head, I get it. I'm also a house head. I also like my drugs, and I'm not really that big on drinking. But when I go to a club, I buy a drink and I tip the bartender. So be an adult and support this scene. And maybe if we're lucky, we'll get some kind of scene back on its ass. off its ass onto its feet. But right where we're now is on its ass. And the problem is that the club scene is not independent of the city in which it exists or the world in which it exists. And that's what we are learning. A DJ can't just get on a plane to Sapporo if there isn't a club in Sapporo to bring him in and a crowd to show up. Same thing for anybody. So all these things are in the air. Any motherfucker out there that tells you, oh, I know that this is happening, or this is what's going to happen, or this is where the stock market's going, or they're full of shit. Don't believe anybody that comes off like they're some genius, because nobody in this world knows what's going to happen. I'm out on the street every day observing, and the shit could hit the fan anytime. Right now, New York is warming up, city's opening up again, Brooklyn's opening up, see some people out on the street, some bodies, see the sun in the air. It's finally springtime. This goddamn snow is gone. But it's like all through the coronavirus, we were saying, boy, the United States is like totally fuck the dog on this one, Donald Trump. Now they're like, oh, look, the United States is doing very well with vaccinations. Europe can't get their shit together. But the point is, if you're a DJ that wants to have a gig in Europe, that's not good news. Just Danny Kriver got a shot, but if he can't do a gig in France because they're locked down, then that means we're not out of the woods yet. But we'll get there, and I'll see you guys out there one day. But yeah, you kids that missed it, I would say come to the Loft, because that's the only thing left that's still keeping that spirit alive from the good old days. When the dinosaurs like Levan, Knuckles, and Mancuso, ruled the roost.
And on that note, we'll end it. Thank you so much for a fantastic interview.
Oh, it was so much fun.
Super cool. Well, enjoy your evening. Have a good night. Thanks a lot. Thanks again, David.
Yeah. Much love. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.